Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 29. Yes, 29 of the Schmidt List. This week, I have Blair Enns, author of Pricing Creativity, plus Robert Nelson, one of the co-founders at Foundry, joins me for the conversation as well. It's a great but long conversation, which could have gone on for a much longer time, honestly. I really enjoyed talking with Blair. He's great. And I really hope you like this episode. It's definitely one I'm going to go back and re-listen to a few times because there's a lot of information in here. So check it out, and I'll see you on the other side of the show. Blair and Robert, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Blair, I'm a big fan of your book, Pricing Creativity, and that's what I'm hoping we're going to talk a lot about today. But to give the audience a bit of background on yourself, how did you get involved in becoming a writer and putting out these books? I know you're doing consulting these days, but kind of give me a quick, what's the background on Blair sort of spiel?
Yeah. So I'm not a consultant. I'm a recovering consultant.
Oh, nice.
Win Without Pitching, my business, was conceived as a consulting practice, new business, sales and new business consulting to creative firms back in early 2002. And then in early 2013, I began the transition from a consulting practice to a training company. So Win Without Pitching is a training organization. We do essentially sales and new business training. I'll pick the phrase depending on the audience. It's really sales training, but most people don't like to hear that, the S word, for creative professionals. So that's what we do now. In terms of how I became an author, I think way back when, after I graduated high school and I was going on to university, well, I was actually academically expelled from university after a year. So after that, I kind of had to figure out what I was going to do, either career-wise or academically. I decided to go back to school, and I was torn between studying business and studying writing, because I really saw myself as a writer, but I really didn't think there was any money to be made in writing. So I chose business. And the irony now is, many years later, I think more than half of what I do in my business is write. So I've always seen myself as an author. And I think most consultants go through this. It's not a phase. It's a pressure that they take on. And I think it comes fairly early on. If you're a solo, like an independent consultant, you feel some sort of pressure to put out a book. So I've always felt that pressure, but it was always something that I really wanted to do. So my first book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, came out in 2010, and then it took me 7 years to get to the next one, Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour, came out in January of 2018.
Also really enjoy, and you were talking about your daughter's now a writer, and about how you guys were talking about the joy of writing, and your take on it versus her talk of her take was that she really enjoys it, and you were expressing how painful it can be.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think we probably recorded that 6 months ago, and in the time since then, she has probably gone from joy to it's like being an entrepreneur. I saw something somebody tweeted the other day. It's like this graph of entrepreneur. I'm on top of the world. Everything's great. And then the next point on the line is way down low. Oh my God, everything's horrible. This business doesn't work. And then woohoo, everything's great.
That's cool. Well, okay,
it's a roller coaster.
Yeah, it really is. And I don't think that changes even at scale sometimes, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I know writers who've just seemed to have figured it out. Like my podcast co-host David C. Baker, he just seems to have writing figured out. He just sets aside the time and he writes it, and he gets done when he says he's going to get done. Like, who works
Listen
that
to him
way?
talk about when he was writing The Business of Expertise, and he's like, "Oh, I just sat down and outlined it. Then I just went in and filled in the outline. Like, with what you do.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah." And I was listening to that, like wanting to punch the radio.
There's almost certainly stories there that he's not telling, but I do remember, getting updates from him. How's the book writing going? Oh, great. Really? No, that's not. Nobody ever says the writing of my book is going great, but he did. So maybe he really did do it that way.
Expertise is a fantastic book.
It's a great book. If the listeners haven't picked it up, please do. It's fantastic.
I totally recommend it. So speaking of books, let's jump into pricing creativity. And so when you were writing this, the overall approach, I mean, I the way that I really like this, and I think David described it as this, he said it's a very dense book, and in the positive sense, it's packed with information. Every sentence. Did you have just so much information that you on the subject that you needed to cram it into something that was more of a manual style versus a narrative? Is that how you felt?
Yeah, I really wanted to I wanted to write a reference book. Like I wanted to write a highly readable reference book that would the reader would read it once the first time, maybe not even the whole thing through, but certainly the first 3 sections, the principles, rules, and maybe even like some of the tips in the 3rd section. And there's a 4th section called tools. So I was hoping people would read the principles and the rules and some of the, pick through the tips. And then the next time they had to price a proposal, they would reach for the book, refresh themselves on the principles and the rules, read the relevant tips. Is it on retainers or leasing instead of selling or pay what you like models or crafting your high priced options? Those are different chapters in the tips section. And then flipping to the tools and using the checklists and the templates to actually create their next proposal. So it is dense. There are more kind of light readable books on pricing out there, but I really wanted this to be the book that says, no, just do this. Like in these situations, just do this for creative professionals.
And I appreciate that.
That's what I got.
So many other books around this subject, in my opinion, are more focused on the narrative a bit more than the if that, then this. And I appreciate that approach.
When I was sending the manuscript out for feedback, and I guess it was past the feedback stage, but I was looking for blurbs from well-known writers and experts in the pricing field. I sent it to quite a famous marketing writer. I won't name him; it wouldn't be appropriate. And he said, "Yeah, I'm happy to take a look at it." And he said, he started reading it. He said, "You want some feedback, or is it too late for some feedback?" I said, "No, by all means." And he said, "I think you should strip out all the economic references, all the footnotes, get it down to," I think he said 5 or maybe 10 key points, tell 3 stories for each point. And I thought, well, that sounds like the books that you write. And I had to write back and say, that sounds like a great model format for a book, but that's not the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write this reference manual. And he was completely he understood, but it was so. I could have written that book, but I really wanted. I didn't want the book. I didn't want the book that a designer or a creative professional would read and go, okay, there's some really good ideas in here. I wanted to write the book, the one that they turn to, that everybody talks about, and that they turn to when they actually have to
very
price
impressed.
something.
It's great. It's quite an enjoyable read, especially when you've been working in professional services for as long as I have. It's very refreshing to read through. So let's dive right in. I want to talk about one of the concepts you bring up in the book called the flip. You talk about how vendors usually get talked down to, and they transfer all the power of their bidding and their solutions to the buying side of the table. And in that, they basically lose a lot of respect from the client side when they immediately put themselves into a vendor situation or vendor position. So tell me a little bit more about the flip and what your thoughts are around that and why the importance of that.
Yeah, so the flip, and that term came from a client of mine a few years ago. He coined the term. The flip is the moment in time when you move in the mind of the client from the vendor position to the expert practitioner position. And it happens. We've all experienced this. If we've been around long enough, we've experienced this probably many times. And it might be you're in a face-to-face meeting or a web meeting where you can see some body language. It might be the moment when the client goes from arms crossed to, okay, this is an audition and you're going to audition. Let's see what you've got. And the arms crossed to uncrossing the arms, flipping open her notebook and taking notes. Or when the two clients on the other side of the table kind of one looks at the other, the little sideways look like,
Yeah.
oh, this is different, and it's when they quit talking and they start listening, or they start using their talking time to ask really meaningful questions of you, and you're impressing them with your expertise. So you go from a vendor where you're, one of many potential solutions providers, and as a result, you have no power or very little power in the buy-sell relationship, to the expert practitioner where you are seen as meaningfully different and you are allowed to lead. And that's vital. We teach to look for that moment as early in the arc of the sale as possible, because the sooner the flip happens, then the lower your cost of sale is likely to be. So I maintain that the flip, you have no business taking on the engagement if the flip hasn't happened, because as the salesperson in the firm, whether you're a full-time dedicated employee charged with sales, or you're the principal who's, among many other things, you're in charge of sales, as the salesperson in the firm, you're not just responsible for winning the business. You're responsible for winning the business at high margin, at low cost of sale, and with the firm positioned to do its best work. And so by position to do its best work, I mean, you are seen as the expert practitioner and you are allowed to lead in the engagement. We've all been, I think, in engagements where the client hires us and then tells us how they want us to go about the engagement. And they have these very defined ideas. And it's the biggest mistake you can make is to go about the engagement the way the client wants you to. That would be like analogous to you going into your surgeon's office and telling him how you wanted your cardiac surgery to be performed, right?
Right.
The surgeon is the expert. You shouldn't be dictating methodology or process to the surgeon. So if it's imperative for you to be able to do your best work, you need to be seen as the expert. You need to be allowed to lead in the engagement. Now, in this way, the sale is the sample. Because if you are not allowed to lead in the sale, if the flip doesn't happen, you're not seen as the expert and you're allowed to take at least somewhat of a leadership position before you're hired, it's not going to happen after you are hired. Therefore, you are impairing your ability to do your best work for the client, to create the most value for the client, and then to capture as much of that value for yourself in the form of remuneration.
So does that kind of imply that if the flip doesn't happen during the sales process, it's probably a client not worth taking on or a project not worth taking on?
Yeah, it really begs the question, and I know the answer. Should you take on an engagement from the vendor position? If you're in a creative firm or any professional firm where you're selling ideas and advice, you're selling expertise, should you really take on an engagement where you're in the vendor position and the client is dictating to you, here's what I need from you, here's how this is going to work, et cetera, et cetera?
My experience as well.
I think the answer is no.
As far as our interaction with our clients, when it's more of a partnership or when it's more like, okay, you guys are the experts, you guys are the technology people, you guys are the design people, I'm going to tell you what my goals are, but I'm going to let you guys lead the rest of it. Those are always the best clients and always the best projects that we have.
Mm-hmm. And the longest lasting clients.
Yeah, and the most pleasant to deal with, to be completely honest.
Yeah, and the most profitable and the most loyal and all of those things, right? Because they're all related to each other. Yeah, and it's the ones where, like, when you've cut price to win, you've done the dance that the client wanted you to do in the sale. You've expressed your passion and enthusiasm for the assignment. You've said, no, we really want this. We're really passionate about working on your brand or your business. And the client says, okay, well, let's just see how passionate you are.
Yeah.
It's those situations when you win, afterwards you think, yeah, all the signs were there. When you look back and you think, this isn't profitable, they're not treating our people well, whatever it is, the signs were always there. And I could take all of those signs and roll them up under the label of, you never moved from vendor to
one of the ways that
I
think one of the ways that I like you talking about how to start working your way into that is asking the right questions. And one of the